Thank you very much, Ann, and it's great to be here, and what a cool bookshop you have here in Salt Lake City, the home of Jack Anderson, who most of our audience has no idea who he was, and most people under the age of 60 have no idea who he was, but he was the most important, most famous journalist who no one's ever heard of today, but maybe that'll change now. The title of my book, Poisoning the Press, Richard Nixon, Jack Anderson, and the Rise of Washington's Scandal Culture. The phrase poisoning the press comes from what literally was a plot, a White House plot to poison a journalist. I know it's hard to believe that this is actually true, but it was. It's one of the most bizarre and least known chapters in American political history, but it really happened. Richard Nixon's White House was so frustrated with columnist Jack Anderson, who was the leading investigative reporter of his day, with so many of his exposés that not only embarrassed the administration, but sent two of Nixon's top advisors, the Attorney General of the United States and the CIA director, ended up pleading guilty for being convicted of crimes, that they actually plotted to kill him. That was the ultimate escalation in a long war that really went back 25 years. But two men whose names you may remember, Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt, met a block from the White House in the Hay Adams Hotel, and they met with a CIA poison expert. And they discussed various ways to poison Anderson in a way that it wouldn't show up in an autopsy in his body. And they did more than just talk about it. They actually acted upon it. They followed Anderson. They tailed him from his office in downtown Washington all the way to his home in Bethesda, Maryland, in the suburbs, to see the route he drove and to see where they could stage an auto crash. Ran into his car from behind so it would flip over, crash, and burn. They then staked out his house, looking for what Howard Hunt called vulnerabilities, where they could break in and poison him in his house. And they wrote up a report for the White House and for the special counsel of the president, Charles Colson, who we all know today as the born-again Christian who advised the Bush White House. But it was called off at the last minute because the burglars were charged with something more important to do. And a few weeks later, they did it. They were arrested at the Watergate Hotel. Had they not been caught, had they not been imprisoned, had the Nixon administration not toppled as a result, Jack Anderson might have died a mysterious death, and nobody but the conspirators themselves would ever have known what happened. So how did we get to that point where a president of the United States, or at least his aides, his advisors, his White House, top men, felt that there was the signal from on high to plot this mafia hit, this rub-out of a journalistic critic? Well, it really goes back to their 25-year battle that started when Nixon first entered public life. And Anderson dogged him all the way through. The infamous Checkers speech, that maudlin, tearful speech where he invoked his dog Checkers. I don't care what anyone says, we're going to keep her, for his daughters. It really went back to an expose that Jack Anderson and his boss dug up about a slush fund Nixon had, and what was really a form of institutionalized bribery. And Nixon kept being pursued by Anderson, who did stories about his mob connections and mob money he got in the 1950s, who did stories about money from Howard Hughes, the billionaire, and favors done in return, who in 1960, on the eve of the election, everybody talks about how 50 years ago the Kennedy-Nixon debates allowed Kennedy to win. Nobody talks about what's in my book, which is how Jack Anderson, in hand in glove with the Kennedys, did a last-minute election eve expose about Nixon's financial scandals that may have been just as pivotal as the presidential debates in the closely fought election. And this dirty trick, it involved a break-in, much like Watergate, came 2 years after Anderson himself was caught bugging in a Washington hotel room. So this bugging and this burglary really stoked Nixon's paranoia, convinced him that he needed dirty tricks like the Democrats had, like his enemy Jack Anderson used. And in many ways helped sow the seeds of what would, become the Watergate scandal that brought him down. Ironically, they had very similar childhoods, Nixon and Anderson. They were both Western boys, born just 30 miles apart in California, Southern California. But the Anderson family moved here to Salt Lake City, the outskirts called Cottonwood. And he was raised in a strict Mormon church, the same way Nixon was raised with a strict fundamentalist Quaker orthodoxy. They both had these volatile authoritarian fathers, but they reacted in different ways. Nixon would maneuver and manipulate his father to avoid angering him. Anderson would defy his father. And this would shape their later psychologies and the way they handled power. Nixon came to the White House with the same kind of manipulative, deceptive approach that he took with his father. Anderson with a hatred for authority and the abuse of power as he saw it. And so they reacted in these very different ways to their similar childhoods. They both came to Washington right after World War II, 1947, and they both would get embroiled in some of the biggest brawls, journalistic and political, over the next 25 years. They both rose to power through slashing attacks on their opponents, and they both became these implacable foes against each other. So that's the story when they each assumed the highest office in their respective professions in 1969. Nixon becomes president. Anderson becomes the columnist who runs the Washington merry-go-round. It's syndicated in more than 1,000 newspapers at its height, and nobody can control Jack Anderson. No single editor or publisher can censor him. Newspapers would occasionally spike him. The Washington Post put him on the comics page as a kind of insult to show their disdain. But he was like the WikiLeaks of his day. Nobody could stop him, and he would get classified documents. If you had dirt in Washington, you knew there was one place to go, Jack Anderson, because the rest of the mainstream media at the time, establishment media, didn't report on scandals, didn't disclose national security secrets, didn't publish documents, let alone what Jack Anderson did. He'd hand them out at press conferences. He would demand to testify before congressional committees and grand juries that would invariably be convened in the wake of his exposés. He viewed himself not just as a chronicler of events, but as a shaper of events. And he injected himself into the fray with glee. They don't make him like Jack Anderson anymore. And he epitomized everything that Richard Nixon loathed and feared. And when Nixon became president, Anderson went after him hammer and tongs, just as he had before he was in the White House. And in a 3-4 month span, he exposed some of his deepest, darkest secrets. He published classified documents showing how the U.S. was secretly arming Pakistan, which then is now this dictatorship, making this pact with the devil. The difference was that Nixon was hiding it from the American people and lying to them and to Congress and even to his own cabinet about what he was doing. But Anderson had a mole in the White House, and the mole slipped him these classified documents, and he published them, and he won the Pulitzer Prize for it and embarrassed the White House. And then soon after, he published yet another expose of secret cash that Nixon was receiving that was used from Howard Hughes, the eccentric billionaire industrialist, that was used to pay for earrings for Pat Nixon, cash for his brothers and his secretary, and drove Nixon into a fury. And then he finally exposed a smoking gun memo that showed that the Republican National Convention was getting this $400,000 pledge in exchange for weakening antitrust action against ITT, one of the biggest conglomerates in the world at that time. So all of these things came together, and Nixon was enraged. First, they tried to prosecute him under the Espionage Act, but Anderson blackmailed the White House with dirt that he had that he threatened to reveal if they went after him or his source. So the White House had to back off. Then Nixon's men tried disinformation. They altered a photo to put Anderson in it to try to implicate him in wrongdoing. They concocted fake documents on White House stationery that they sent to him to try to get him to go with the story that was bogus. They even discussed, and the White House tapes show this, God bless the White House tapes,